Victoria, played by Rochelle Lefevre. Then, 29. Now, 47. James, played by Cam Gigande. Then, 26. Now, 44. Laurent, played by Eddie Gathegi. Then, 29. Now, 47. Alice Cullen, played by Ashley Greene. Then, 21. Now, 39. Jasper Hale, played by Jackson Rathbone. Then, 23. Now, 41. Rosalie Hale, played by Nikki Reed. Then, 20. Now, 38. Emmett Cullen, played by Kellen Lutz. Then, 23. Now, 41. Esme Cullen, played by Elizabeth Reeser. Then, 33. Now, 51. Carlisle Cullen, played by Peter Facinelli. Then, 35. Now, 53. Charlie Swan, played by Billy Burke. Then, 41. Now, 59. Billy Black, played by Gil Birmingham. Then, 55. Now, 73. Jane, played by Dakota Fanning. Then, 14. Now, 32. Caius, played by Jamie Campbell Bower. Then, 20. Now, 38. Marcus, played by Christopher Heyerdahl. Then, 45. Now, 63. Dimitri, played by Charlie Bewley. Then, 28. Now, 46. Felix, played by Daniel Cudmore. Then, 27. Now, 45. Arrow, played by Michael Sheen. Then, 39. Now, 57. Irina, played by Maggie Grace. Then, 25. Now, 43. Eleazar, played by Christian Camargo. Then, 39. Now, 57. Garrett, played by Lee Pace. Then, 32. Now, 47. Tanya, played by Mayanna Buring. Then, 29. Now, 47. Carmen, played by Mia Maestro. Then, 30. Now, 48. Zafrina, played by Judy Ciccone. Then, 27. Now, 45. Alec, played by Cameron Bright. Then, 15. Now, 33. Kate, played by Casey Laboff. Then, 25. Now, 43. Riley Beers, played by Xavier Samuel. Then, 26. Now, 42. Benjamin, played by Rami Malek. Then, 29. Now, 45. Jacob Black, played by Taylor Lautner. Then, 16. Now, 34. Bella Swan, played by Kristen Stewart. Then, 18. Now, 36. Edward Cullen, played by Robert Pattinson. Then, 22. Now, 40. Renesmee Cullen, played by Mackenzie Foy. Then, 12. Now, 26. Jessica Stanley, played by Anna Kendrick. Then, 23. Now, 41. Mike Newton, played by Michael Welch. Then, 21. Now, 39. Eric Yerke, played by Justin Chon. Then, 27. Now, 45. Angela Weber, played by Christian Serratos. Then, 18. Now, 36. Leah Clearwater, played by Julia Jones. Then, 27. Now, 45. Sam Yulee, played by Chasky Spencer. Then, 33. Now, 51.